The screaming stopped hours ago. What remains is the silence, and Catherine Howard has already learned that silence is never empty. It presses against the walls of Hampton Court like a held breath, heavy with meaning. Candles have burned down to stubs in her chamber, their light no longer warm but thin and wavering, as if even the flame understands that it is nearing its end. Catherine is 19 years old. Until this morning, she was Queen of England. Now she sits forbidden to leave her rooms, watched by guards who will not meet her eyes, listening to footsteps in the corridor that do not belong to her ladies, her servants, or anyone who comes bearing comfort. These are official steps, measured, deliberate, the kind that arrive only after decisions have already been made somewhere else. 6 hours ago, she was the wife of Henry VIII, the most powerful woman in the kingdom, a girl who rose from obscurity to wear the crown that had already claimed the lives of other queens. Anne Boleyn had died for it. Jane Seymour had died wearing it. Catherine stepped into a role haunted by blood and childbirth and ruin. And for 16 months, she learned how to survive inside it, how to smile while fear rose in her throat, how to speak with certainty while the ground beneath her felt unsteady, how to wear velvet and jewels like armor. Now the armor is gone. The king has not come. The king has not sent word. Henry Tudor, her husband, has locked himself away in his own apartments. Catherine knows this because she can hear him. The walls of Hampton Court were built for grandeur, not privacy. Sound travels, and the sound of a king weeping, raw, uncontrolled, carries through the palace. It is not a sound that inspires pity. It inspires dread, because grief has already turned inward, because anger, when it comes, will come cold. The footsteps stop outside her door. There is a knock, formal, precise, the knock of a man who has practiced delivering bad news. Enter. Catherine says, her voice does not tremble. She has learned that much. The door opens, and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer stands in the threshold, his expression carefully arranged into something that resembles pastoral concern, but does not reach his eyes. Behind him stand guards, more than necessary for a courtesy visit. Their presence is not protection. It is containment. Your Majesty. Cranmer says, the title sounds different now. This morning it was acknowledgement. Now it sounds like accusation. I come on the king's business. He continues gently. There are matters that require urgent discussion. Catherine notices the papers in his hand, dense with ink, statements, testimony. She does not need to read them to understand what they represent. Somewhere in this palace, people are speaking, servants, courtiers, old acquaintances who have learned that survival requires cooperation. What matters? She asks. Cranmer steps fully into the room. The guards remain at the door, as if the space itself no longer belongs to her. They concern your conduct, he says, both before your marriage to His Majesty and during it. The words land with a weight that Catherine feels in her chest. Before the marriage is dangerous, humiliating, ruinous. Henry believed he married a virgin. To learn otherwise would wound his pride, and a wounded king can be deadly. But after the marriage, after vows, after coronation, anything resembling intimacy becomes treason. Treason means death. I do not understand, Catherine replies, because sometimes the only defense is to force the accusation to speak plainly. Cranmer's eyes do not change. I believe you do. He speaks of witnesses, of consistency, of names from her past, Henry Mannix, Francis Derham, figures from a household where doors did not always close properly, where supervision was thin, where a girl learned too late that attention could become a weapon. Catherine feels the trap tightening. These are not rumors. These are recollections sharpened into evidence. And there are accounts, Cranmer adds, of conduct after your marriage. Private meetings. At night, Thomas Culpeper. Catherine measures her words carefully now. Every sentence is a weight placed on a scale she cannot see. I spoke with Master Culpeper, she says, as queens speak with gentlemen of the court. Privately, Cranmer replies, with Lady Rochford standing watch. Jane Boleyn, widow of Anne Boleyn's brother, a woman who knows exactly how quickly favor curdles into execution. What requires a lookout? Cranmer asks softly. If nothing improper is occurring, Catherine has no answer that will save her. Cranmer is not here to be convinced. He is here to record. He tells her she must write a full account of her life before the marriage. During it, that the king requires honesty, that if her account conflicts with testimony already gathered, there will be further questioning. He does not threaten her. He does not need to. Tudor justice does not rely on overt cruelty. It relies on isolation, repetition, and the knowledge that everyone around you can be pressured until the story the crown wants finally emerges. "I will write my account," Catherine says. "I will wait," Cranmer replies, and he sits down. Catherine understands then that she will not be allowed privacy, not to think, not to pray, not to weep. She is trapped inside a process already in motion. The quill waits on the table. The paper lies blank and unforgiving. This is how Tudor power works. Testimony is gathered first. Servants, relatives, friends, enemies. Everyone is questioned. Repeatedly, inconsistencies become weapons. Silence becomes guilt. Only then is the accused brought in, not to explain, but to be measured against what others have already said. Catherine begins to write, knowing that every sentence might become a rope, or a thread thin enough to delay the tightening. History remembers Catherine Howard for her execution. The blade, the scaffold, the speed with which a queen becomes a body. But the execution took seconds. The true destruction unfolded over months. It was isolation, interrogation, the systematic dismantling of every relationship that had ever made her feel safe. She would learn what it meant to survive without knowing whether survival was a kindness or a cruelty. She would wait without a trial, without a formal charge, watching others fall as warnings of what awaited her. Lady Rochford would be arrested, interrogated, broken by pressure until her mind fractured under the weight of it. English law did not permit the execution of the insane, so Parliament would change the law. Not broadly, specifically, to ensure that no obstacle remained. Catherine would learn that laws, like mercy, existed only when they were convenient. Weeks would pass. Letters would go unanswered. Pleas would vanish into silence. Henry would remain unreachable, sealed away behind pride and fury. And Catherine would understand that what she was experiencing was not chaos, but design, a machine that did not rush, a system that waited until resistance exhausted itself. When the summons finally came, it would not bring relief. It would bring the tower, but for now, Catherine writes, the candles sputter lower, the guards remain in place. Cranmer watches, and the silence, heavy, deliberate, closes in around a 19-year-old girl who understands. At last, that death is not the worst thing that can happen to a queen. The weeks that followed unfolded in a suspended state of waiting that Catherine would later understand as its own form of punishment. She was moved from her private chambers to smaller rooms within Hampton Court, an administrative decision. She was told, temporary, necessary, but she understood what it meant. She was being separated from her household, from anyone who might offer loyalty rather than observation. The women permitted to remain with her were carefully chosen, ladies whose allegiance belonged first to the king, whose duty was to listen and report. She did not see Henry. She would never see Henry again. What she heard, carried through corridors and servants' whispers, was that the king's grief had hardened into rage. He raged against deception, against betrayal, against anyone who had failed to warn him. The investigation widened. It always widened. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine's grandmother, by marriage, whose household had shaped her childhood, was questioned. Her servants were questioned. Anyone who had lived under her roof during Catherine's girlhood was summoned, interrogated, pressured to remember things they had long ago learned to forget. Henry Mannix was arrested. Francis Derham was arrested. Thomas Culpeper was arrested. Jane Rochford was arrested. One by one, the people Catherine had trusted disappeared into rooms where truth was not discovered, but manufactured. Testimony was gathered not to understand, but to confirm the most damaging possible interpretation of events. Tudor justice did not ask whether a thing had happened. It asked whether it could be made to fit the charge. Catherine was questioned repeatedly. Each time, her answers were compared against statements extracted elsewhere. Every discrepancy became proof of deception. Every clarification became evidence of guilt. She admitted what she could not deny. Monarchs, Dereham. She framed those relationships as the indiscretions of youth in a household without proper supervision. She denied a pre-contract of marriage with Derham, understanding that such a contract could invalidate her marriage to Henry and turn her entire queenship into fraud. And she denied adultery. The meetings with Culpeper, she admitted. Conversations. Words. Nothing more. The distinction mattered. Adultery after marriage was treason. Treason required death. Her denial was a gamble. It depended on Culpeper telling the same story. He did not. Under questioning, Culpeper admitted intention. He confessed that he had meant to do ill with the queen, and that he believed she was similarly inclined. In Tudor law, intention was enough. The mere willingness to betray the king's marriage was itself treasonous. The investigators did not need proof of physical intimacy. They had what they needed. On December 1st, 1541, Dereham and Culpeper were tried. The proceedings were brief. The verdict was inevitable. Both men were found guilty of treason. Culpeper, as a gentleman, was granted the mercy of beheading. Dereham was not. On December 10th, they were executed at Tyburn. Catherine did not witness their deaths, but she learned how they died. Someone ensured that she knew. Culpeper knelt and died quickly. Dereham was hanged, cut down while still alive, disemboweled, emasculated, quartered. Their heads were placed on spikes on London Bridge, where they would remain for months, rotting warnings visible to anyone entering the city. This was not justice. It was instruction. Nearly 3 weeks after Cranmer's first visit, Catherine was informed that she was no longer queen. The Privy Council, acting in the king's name, stripped her of her title. She was no longer addressed as Your Majesty. She was Catherine Howard again, the girl from a chaotic household who had briefly worn a crown. She was not taken to the Tower. Not yet. Instead, she was moved to Sion Abbey, a former monastery converted to secular use. There she would remain while the investigation concluded and her fate was determined. The rooms were comfortable enough. She had servants, food, heat, but she was entirely alone. No visitors, no letters delivered, no news except what officials chose to share. The waiting was the worst part. Each day she woke, not knowing whether she would live or die, whether mercy would come, or a warrant. Henry had shown mercy before. He was unpredictable. That hope, fragile, humiliating, refused to die completely. Catherine wrote letters she knew might never be delivered. She prayed, she waited. Christmas passed. The new year arrived. Nothing changed, except Lady Rochford. Jane Rochford had broken under interrogation. By December, she was incoherent, unable to understand the charges against her or participate in her own defense. Under English law, the insane could not be executed. This created a problem for the king. The solution was simple. Parliament passed a special act allowing the execution of insane persons if their crimes warranted it. The law was rewritten, not as a general reform, but as a targeted weapon. Catherine learned of this decision and understood its meaning immediately. If the law could be changed to kill Jane Rochford, it could be changed to kill her. There were no safeguards left, no technicalities to hide behind. Only time. On February 10th, 1542, the message finally came. Catherine was to be moved again. This time, the destination was the Tower of London. The Tower was where traitors went to die. Anne Boleyn had passed through its gates. Others would follow. Its reputation was earned through centuries of blood. When Catherine heard the words, something inside her collapsed, some final hope she had not admitted she still carried. By all accounts, she did not collapse outwardly. She entered the barge that would carry her along the Thames with composure intact. The journey was deliberate. She passed under London Bridge, where the heads of Dereham and Culpeper still hung. The sight was intentional, a final lesson. She entered the Tower through the Watergate, later called Traitor's Gate, and was escorted to her rooms. And there, Catherine Howard began to prepare for death. She asked for the execution block to be brought to her chamber. She wanted to practice, a teenage girl rehearsing the act of dying so that she would not falter, would not shame herself, would not give her enemies the satisfaction of watching her break. Whatever had shattered inside her during the long weeks at Sion, she rebuilt now into something hard and controlled. If she could not command her fate, she would command her final moments. The morning of February 13th, 1542, was cold. Catherine dressed in simple garments chosen to ease the headsman's task. She prayed. She steadied herself. Only a small number of witnesses were permitted. This was not spectacle. It was administration. She walked to the scaffold without assistance. She did not weep. She spoke as tradition required, acknowledging fault, praying for the king, but she did not confess to adultery. Even at the end, she refused to grant them that. It was her last act of defiance. She knelt. She placed her head on the block exactly as she had practiced. One stroke. It was over. Lady Rochford followed moments later. Their bodies were buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Near Anne Boleyn, another queen destroyed by the same king, Henry did not attend. He did not acknowledge their deaths. Within a year, he would marry again. Catherine Howard would be remembered, when she was remembered at all, as a cautionary tale. But the worst part of her story was not the execution. The worst part was everything that came before it. Long before the axe fell, Catherine Howard had already learned what it meant to be powerless in a system designed to erase you slowly. Her execution lasted seconds. The months leading to it were an education in controlled suffering, one that Tudor authority perfected and repeated whenever the crown felt threatened. The isolation began immediately after her arrest. Catherine was never allowed to shape the narrative of her own life. Others did that for her, men who controlled testimony, women pressured into remembering details that suited the case, servants who understood that survival depended on cooperation. Truth became secondary. Consistency was everything. The state did not seek understanding. It sought alignment. Every person connected to Catherine was interrogated. Manox was forced to revisit her childhood, framing adolescent vulnerability as calculated immorality. Derryham was tortured until he confessed to whatever investigators wanted to hear. Culpeper's admission of intent sealed her fate. Jane Rochford's descent into madness was not an accident of weakness, but the predictable result of prolonged pressure and terror. Catherine watched the destruction ripple outward. People she had loved were ruined to ensure her isolation was complete. By the time she was moved to Sion Abbey, she understood that survival no longer depended on innocence or guilt. It depended on the king's mood, and Henry VIII was done feeling merciful. The knowledge that Parliament had rewritten the law to execute Jane Rochford stripped away the final illusion of protection. Law was not a shield. It was a tool. If the crown wanted you dead, legality would follow. Yet the most haunting moment of Catherine's story did not occur in the Tower. It happened earlier, at Hampton Court. In the days after her arrest, before the walls fully closed in, Catherine made one last attempt to reach Henry. She broke away from her guards and ran through the palace corridors toward the gallery that connected the Queen's apartments to the King's rooms. She believed desperately that if she could see him, if she could speak, explain, plead, remind him of the girl he once adored, everything might change. She never reached him. Guards intercepted her in the gallery. She screamed. She begged. She was dragged back while Henry, perhaps only steps away, remained unreachable. Whether he heard her or chose not to listen no longer mattered. That moment sealed her fate more surely than any confession. The corridor still exists. It is called the Haunted Gallery. Visitors claim to hear screams there, a young woman crying out for a king who would not come. Whether the ghost is real is irrelevant. The history is not. Catherine Howard did run, she did scream, and Henry VIII did nothing. When Catherine finally knelt at the scaffold, she was not simply submitting to execution. She was ending a process that had already stripped her of dignity, safety, and voice. Her refusal to confess to adultery was not denial. It was resistance. The last fragment of agency left to a 19-year-old queen crushed by machinery far larger than herself. What Henry moved on. He always did. Catherine did not. She was buried quietly. Near Anne Boleyn, another young woman discarded once her usefulness ended. No monument marked her grave. No apology followed. Her name survived mainly as warning, not as person. But Catherine Howard was not merely foolish, or reckless, or weak. She was young in a court that devoured the young. She was vulnerable in a system that rewarded cruelty. And she suffered long before she was allowed to die. Remember Catherine Howard. Remember not just the blade, but the months of silence, interrogation, isolation, and fear that preceded it. Remember the corridor. Remember the screams. Remember how close she came to mercy, and how deliberately it was denied.